Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Catherine Coley. Listeners, Catherine is Director of the Prevention and Education Department at the French Anti-Doping Agency, or AFLD. Today, we're going to talk more about AFLD, Catherine's work there, and preparations they're making for the upcoming 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So, Catherine, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hello, Mary. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, and I'm excited to welcome you to the show and to learn more about you and the wonderful work you're doing. So can you start by telling me and our listeners just a little bit more about the French Anti-Doping Agency, maybe its history and the mission?
Absolutely. And just before we start, Mary, thank you for having me and for giving us this opportunity. So yes, AFLD, so French Anti-Doping Agency, but AFLD stands for Agence Française de Lutte contre le Dopage, said with a French-Canadian accent, of course, but everyone knows it in the anti-doping community as AFLD. Before telling you about AFLD, I'd like to take a step back and tell you about the structure of sport in France. So in 1945, sport was categorized as a public service. And since then, the promotion of physical activity has been a matter of public interest in France, and sport is regulated by the state. So as a consequence, sports rules in France are of an administrative nature. Therefore, the French state has jurisdiction to set the national anti-doping laws, and we'll see later how this is important. So in 1999, the law established the first administrative authority called Conseil de Prévention et de Lutte contre le Dopage, CPRD, and in 2006, a new law implemented both the principles of the first version of the World Anti-Doping Code and created the independent public authority that is now AFLD. And since then, so AFLD has been conducting missions of a NOTO, so namely testing, results management, research, prevention, education, and so on.
I love that you shared the history there. I think that helps us kind of envision how AFLD got to the point where it is today. But I guess, can you go into a little bit more detail about your specific role there in the organization and what your responsibilities are?
So I'm the director of the Education and Prevention Department. So with the team, I developed the education plan, the education annual programs, and that includes our educators training that perhaps we can discuss more later on that we started last November. It includes as well the development of our e-learning platform, among other projects. And we also oversee the athlete committee that was launched in 2019.
Oh, very interesting. And you are an athlete as well, Catherine. So can you share more about your athletic career and maybe how you became interested in the anti-doping side of sport?
I've always loved sports, to play it, to practice it, to watch it. I still train and compete in swimming, and that is thanks to my colleague Floriane in the legal department, who introduced me to her swim club. I also play tennis on a regular basis, but I was never an elite athlete. I didn't compete at the international level. But my good friend Lynn was a pro cyclist, and at the time, she did suffer from a rival who, it was later discovered, was doping. And essentially that broke my heart because there's nothing I felt I could do. So when the opportunity at WADA presented to join the communications department, I thought, this is great. This is my chance perhaps to make a small difference in keeping sport clean and to contribute to a cause that was aligned with my personal values.
Absolutely. And I think this is an experience that unfortunately too many athletes have had, where one of these cases comes up where they find out that there was evidence that doping occurred that might have impacted the medal standings or the rankings in terms of a particular sport or a particular event. So can you talk a little bit more about how this experience really made you decide to take this jump?
It's a good point, Mary, because those testimonials are just heartbreaking when you see that athletes missed out on chances on medals because of doping. And one of the reasons I wanted to get involved is to try to make a difference for those athletes and try to protect clean sport and protect clean athletes. And that's my nature, to protect people around me and those I care about. And I deeply care about athletes and trying to make a difference so that they could compete clean and get the results and medals and opportunities that they deserve.
Absolutely. I think getting that recognition is so important. And I'm glad that you've decided to take an active role in clean sport. You've had an interesting career so far. So prior to starting there at AFLD, you actually worked at the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, as manager of communications. So can you tell us a little bit more about your career experiences there at WADA and how those experiences may have informed your current work that you're doing now?
I mean, what better place to learn about anti-doping than WADA? So I worked there for 7 years in the communications department. Obviously, I worked closely with all the other departments, which was a great learning experience. I had the opportunity to coordinate some of the outreach teams at major events, also supported the athlete committee activities at the time. So really, I learned so much, and I'm very grateful to my former colleagues who basically taught me everything.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot to learn when you jump into anti-doping. A lot of people who are entering the field say there's a steep learning curve. What really helped you learn the ropes?
Well, at the time, really, I learned mostly on the job. I'm a curious person and I like to learn about everything. And working in communications was definitely the perfect role to learn about all the anti-doping activities. If I were to join an anti-doping organization today, or WADA, it would likely be different, as WADA has developed many resources to help us learn about anti-doping. For example, as part of the GLDF initiative, the Global Learning and Development Framework, WADA published the first set of professional standards that aim at improving the level of knowledge, skills, and competencies of the global anti-doping workforce. And this was developed with anti-doping professionals from around the globe. And as part of this initiative, WADA will provide training in different areas of anti-doping, which will be given by a team of trainers with experience in anti-doping. And I'm fortunate enough to be part of that team of trainers.
Definitely. Well, it sounds like you had some great resources at your fingertips then, and it prepared you, it sounds like, for some of the challenges that you faced when you entered this position at AFLD, because you were actually tasked with building a new department for communication and doping prevention from the ground up. So, Catherine, what was this experience like for you?
Mary, how much time have we got? It was both very exciting and a little frightening. Very exciting because it was an amazing opportunity, as well as a great challenge, both on a personal and professional level, but also a little frightening for a couple of reasons. First, you end up in a country where you share some of the language, theoretically, but not the same cultural references. It's a very different work culture. So there was definitely a period of adjustment. Also, even though I had experience in anti-doping, I was tasked with setting up a whole new department in an already well-established anti-doping organization. So the department was new, I was new, not to mention a stranger, because I'm not French, which was a little awkward at first for the French anti-doping community. And I guess one of the biggest challenges when I first started was to get to know our stakeholders, the Ministry of Sport, the NOC, the Paralympic Committee, not to mention the sports federations, and establish relationships with them and build trust. I've been there since mid-2018. And in July 2021, we decided to split the activities of communication and education. So we've recruited people to handle communications and media relations. And I now focus on the education aspects, which is the part I really enjoy. So our education department currently has a great team of 4 that will expand over the next few years.
Fantastic. And I know there are a lot of aspects in which AFLD excels. So in your opinion, what are some of the things that you think that AFLD does particularly well?
The first aspect I would like to mention is ensuring compliance of the French law with the World Anti-Doping Code. So I talked earlier about the administrative nature of French sports rules and about the French state having jurisdiction to set the national anti-doping laws. So since only the state has jurisdiction to produce anti-doping rules, these are adopted in the same way as other French laws and regulations. So as a state party of the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport, France has to adopt appropriate measures which are compliant with the principles of the World Anti-Doping Code. Therefore, the state has to modify laws and national regulations every time the code is updated. Now, I will skip the process that involves the Parliament, the government, the Constitution, and the Council of State. But I will just say that ensuring compliance of the French law with the World Anti-Doping Code is a very complex process. And I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the work of my colleagues from the legal department who have given their blood, sweat, and tears to this task over the past 2 years. The second activity that AFLD does particularly well, I think, is testing. They have a great team. They have the expertise, a solid DCO training program with a network of DCOs. And really, it runs like a well-oiled machine that is definitely ready for the major sport events that will be held in France over the next few years. And the third aspect I would like to mention is our relatively new investigation and intelligence department. Investigations have always been a strong suit at AFLD, even when there were no official department. And we also have a great collaboration with the I&I teams at WADA as well. So these are just a few examples of things that I think AFLD does particularly well.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of strength there at AFLD. And we touched in the very beginning on just some of the changes, the evolution of the organization over time and how it came to be. So this is not something that just sort of stops in anti-doping. The changes keep happening. Organizations keep evolving. So, Catherine, can you talk about some of the major changes that the French Anti-Doping Agency has undergone, even just within the past few years?
I've already mentioned the translation of the code into French law. One of the other major changes of the past few years was definitely the creation of the Education Department and the implementation of the ISE, the International Standard for Education, which is a mandatory document in anti-doping. And doing it in coordination with the other stakeholders in France that had been doing prevention before the department was created at AFLD was also a challenge. Another major change I could mention relates to the French anti-doping laboratory. So the lab was previously the Department of Analysis of AFLD, but since the International Standard for Laboratory requires that the lab is independent from the National Anti-Doping Organization, the French Anti-Doping Laboratory is now independent from the NATO and attached to the University Paris-Saclay, where it will actually move in 2023 with state-of-the-art technology and leading research teams ready to tackle the major sports events starting in 2023 with the Rugby World Cup.
Perfect. But I guess what are some of the other major issues that the French Anti-Doping Agency is facing right now?
Mary, we have the same challenges as other ADOs relating to the budget, of course. Another major challenge we're facing, rather than an issue really, relates to anti-doping education. With the upcoming 2024 Games, the expectations placed on athletes and the athlete personnel will be high. All eyes will be on France. And in terms of anti-doping education, we have to ensure that athletes and athlete support personnel are prepared and ready. And that work has already started, including with our RTP athletes, for example, to reduce the number of whereabouts failures.
Excellent. But I know you've been doing some specific targeted work focused on these whereabouts failures. So, Catherine, can you give us a little bit more detail about those efforts?
One thing that we wanted to improve and we thought was relatively easy to tackle was the number of whereabouts failures by the athletes in our RTP registered testing pool. So RTP athletes need to update their information in ADAMS on a regular basis. And a few years ago, we had a lot of whereabouts failures due to athletes not updating their whereabouts or not putting in the necessary information. And so we set up a communications and education plan for RTP athletes with the aim of reducing the number of whereabouts failures and ultimately the ADRVs linked to whereabouts failures, especially with the 2024 Games fast approaching. And we have, Mary, already seen improvements in the number of whereabouts failures, and the questions that we have from athletes and whereabouts information are updated.
Excellent. So we all know that education is a critical piece in preventing doping, and education is, of course, your specialty there. So can you tell us more about AFLD's anti-doping education program, Catherine?
Like all other ADOs, we're working at implementing the International Standard for Education. So developing an education plan and education program with specific actions. In 2022-2023, we'll be focusing on a few things. One of them is our educators training program. So we're training people from different sport organizations, sport federations, players' union, leagues, and so on, to become educators on anti-doping matters. So the idea is to build a network of educators across the country that will contribute to the implementation of AFLD's anti-doping education program.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. And I love the idea that you and other NADOs are engaging more people in this education initiative to really amplify the impacts that you can have, because I think you're absolutely right. There's way too many people for you as a relatively small department to be able to kind of individually be educating every athlete there. But I think that is phenomenal. And I think this education, as you sort of alluded to, is an exciting project that you guys are implementing at the moment. Are there other things that you're working on right now that you're really excited about, Catherine, that you want to share with me and our listeners?
Well, another project that we're focusing on is the development of our e-learning platform that's intended for our target audiences. So obviously athletes and athlete support personnel, but also for our educators training, as well as our doping control officers and chaperone trainings. Another thing that we're really enthusiastic about, and it's not a project per se, but it's our work with the athlete committee. It was really important for AFLD to place athletes at the center of the strategy and to include them in the development of our programs and policies. And we're very fortunate to be collaborating with 11 members that are engaged, that are committed, and that we can consult on a regular basis for the development of our programs, mainly education related.
Absolutely. And I think all of this amazing work that you're doing, Catherine, is contributing to further bringing France to the forefront. And I think this is evidenced by some of the upcoming events that are going to be held there in France. We mentioned the Rugby World Cup that's going to be held in Paris next year in 2023. And this is a major international event. So can you tell us a little bit more about what AFLD is doing to sort of start planning for this big event?
Yes, the Rugby World Cup is definitely a huge event, and it's going to be huge in France. We have started the planning with the organizing committee, as well as with World Rugby, with which we have a great relationship with Mike and Dave and Ross and the whole team. And obviously that always helps in planning for such big events. We'll be involved on both the testing side and the education side. Testing is a little more straightforward, and it's been discussed and I want to say arranged already. Whereas education, we've started the discussions and we'll get more specific on this aspect at the beginning of next year.
Fantastic. And I know we hinted in the introduction as well that the 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games are also going to be held in Paris. So, Catherine, what does this mean for the AFLD? And are there preparations that you're going to be making in your role there specifically as the Games approach?
Yes, another huge event in France. So as I mentioned, expectations will be high, especially placed on French athletes and support personnel. So once again, we'll have to make sure that they are well equipped in terms of anti-doping education. We are working with the organizing committee on various aspects currently, including testing, and they have obviously our full support for the preparation of those games.
Excellent. Well, I am so excited for these upcoming events that are going to be held in Paris. And I think many of our listeners are looking forward to them as well. And I know in advance of the games, France is hosting a global education conference. So can you tell me and our listeners more about this exciting upcoming event?
So the Global Education Conference gathers anti-doping practitioners and researchers from around the world. So we share and discuss education program development and how basically ADOs can enhance their education programs while keeping athletes and their support personnel at the center of the learning strategies. And France will be hosting the 2024 edition just before the Olympics. And it will be a great opportunity to rally the anti-doping community in a global campaign to raise awareness about clean sport ahead of the Games.
Excellent. And while we're thinking about the future, when you think about AFLD, are there particular goals that AFLD is working towards, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years that you can tell us about?
Definitely, Mary, continuing the development of our relationships with our stakeholders. That's very, very important to us, as well as with the athletes, placing the athletes at the center of our strategies and the development of our policies and programs. And more generally speaking, keeping on increasing the knowledge of anti-doping rules among athletes, their support personnel, but also all the other target audiences, including parents, media, and really everyone who engages in sport and who loves sport.
Wonderful. And I know developing relationships is so important in sport more generally and in anti-doping specifically. So I'm always curious to hear a little bit more about how people got connected with or developed a relationship with the Partnership for Clean Competition. So, Catherine, can you comment on how you first heard about the PCC and that relationship development?
I heard about PCC first when I was at WADA. PCC has always been, since its creation, a great contributor to anti-doping and research as well. And hopefully, while at AFLD, we can develop a relationship with PCC.
Fantastic. Well, Catherine, we've talked about a lot of different subjects, and throughout our conversation, we've sort of mentioned some of these challenges, some of these struggles that come up in anti-doping. And I think it's important to dream big because anti-doping is constantly evolving. We're continuing to advance different aspects of it as we move into the future. So if we took away a lot of the barriers that normally hold you back, is there one problem or one challenge in anti-doping that you would want to address first?
I would like to tell you that basically anything that could make the lives of the athletes easier in following the anti-doping rules, period.
Absolutely. Well, I know, Catherine, making the lives of the athletes easier is definitely important because there are a lot of steps and it's a complicated process for them. So when you think about it, is this something that you've heard a lot of feedback from the athlete committee and others? They're looking for specific changes?
Something that comes up very often is related to the whereabouts, updating the whereabouts information. It seems, although we've made lives of athletes much easier with, for example, the app Athlete Central, still a lot of the times I hear, well, can't you just put a bracelet or even a chip so that you can locate me wherever I am so that I don't have to update my whereabouts information and so on. And I mean, we're talking science fiction here a little bit, but that's one comment that I have very often.
Absolutely. Like you said, I think these preventable situations for doping are the most heartbreaking because some sort of education, some simple steps of process could definitely alleviate those. But I think, yeah, you run into this challenge of convenience versus privacy and kind of who values what and how you're going to navigate that situation. So definitely something for all of us in the anti-doping community to think about going forward.
Yes, definitely.
And we covered a lot of topics in our conversation today, Catherine, but if our listeners want to learn more about you, more about AFLD, what's the best way for them to do so?
AFLD's website, afld.fr, and we're working on our English version. We're also on Twitter and LinkedIn and soon on Instagram. But also, Mary, to our listeners, please feel free to reach out directly. If you have any questions, you want to know more about anything, we'll be happy to discuss.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Catherine and with AFLD if you have any questions. And Catherine, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Mary, thanks to you. And thank you once again for the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your insights with all of us. Listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here as well. And if you haven't already, it would mean a lot to us here at the PCC if you could rate our podcast and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.